Hey folks, welcome back. My name is Cyrus Davis, and today I have another deck profile for you for the post-rotation format. This time on a bit more of a rogue deck. Definitely not a deck that people are respecting a whole lot right now. I think that it definitely has some core issues, but it's definitely better than people are giving it credit for. It has some interesting options that I wanted to cover in this video that people aren't necessarily focusing on as much. I think people sort of maybe misunderstand the core game plan of the deck. But Zoroark is a new archetype from Journey Together, one of the trainers archetypes, and definitely the best of the trainers archetypes that were introduced, but definitely lacking in a few options still. Zoroark, of course, has the trade ability, similar to Curlia's Refinement from last format. Allows you to discard a card from your hand once per turn and then draw 2 new cards. Great way to get your Dark Energy in the discard pile. Great way to just draw through your deck and sustain a strong board throughout the game. And then its attack for 2 Dark Energy allows us to copy the attacks of any of our other Ends Pokemon. So there are a couple of other Ends Pokemon that you could be using. In this build, I think we're just using Darmanitan and Reshiram. I think that the other attackers honestly just aren't really worth it right now. I think that they're cute and they offer some neat options, but ultimately not very good cards. So we're just focusing on copying Darmanitan, which allows us to do 90 damage to our opponent's active Pokemon and 90 damage to one of their bench Pokemon, and then discard all energy from the attacking Pokemon. So very similar to Moonlight Shuriken from last format, and sort of trying to use it in the same way. And then the Reshiram for 2 energy. Well, the energy cost on the Reshiram don't matter because we're always going to be copying it with Zoroark, but allows us to do 20 damage times the number of damage counters already on our Zoroark, which means that if our opponent tries to hit into Zoroark for a 2-shot, they will often be met with a 1-shot from us in response by copying Reshiram's attack. And then Reshiram's second attack, which is underwhelming, but surprisingly an attack that we are going to use quite often, just as a blanket 170 damage with no other effects or costs. Not an ideal amount of damage to do, but with cards like Binding Mochi, like you can see on the image here attached to the Zoroark, we can go ahead and get the damage up to 210, which is very, very relevant for a lot of basic Pokemon EX in the format. So allows us to at least still, even without the damage boost from the first attack, still be taking knockouts and applying pressure in some important spots. Does also allow us to one-shot things like Gardevoir EX with weakness. So 170, not an ideal number to hit, but not a bad number either once boosted by things like Binding Mochi and Defiance Band, and then potentially some Adrenabrain damage in there depending on the matchup. So those are the 3 attacks that we're going to be using with the deck. Luckily, we can use them all with our 280 HP Zoroark, which is what makes the deck so good, but we do have some other options to explore. So let's get right into the deck list from there. So Pokemon, we have the 4-4 and Zoroark line. We want to get as many of these into play as possible, as often as possible, for that trade ability, just to see as many cards as we can. 4-4 here is a no-brainer, especially with not a lot of access to getting cards at the prize cards in this format. Then we just have a 2-2 Darmanitan line. We really only need to set up one of these per game, and if it starts getting picked off, we do have Pokemon Recovery. So we're only really playing a 2-2 for prizing purposes, to make sure that we can at least try to use Darmanitan every single game. As far as like actually getting the Darumaka and stuff out, there's typically better just playing more search cards, I think, rather than trying to fit more copies of Darumaka. It's not really a Pokemon that you want to start with its 2 retreat cost either. So the 2-2 Darmanitan just works here. And then 2 copies of Reshiram for the same reason. We want to use it most games, if not every game, but we just don't want to prize it. We never need more than 1 copy. We can just recover it if our opponent targets it down. And it's usually not optimal for our opponent to target down the Reshiram anyways, so just playing that for prizing purposes. I'm playing 1 copy of Budew, which is actually surprisingly important in this deck. We are an Evo TM deck, so that is often what we're trying to do on our first turn if we go second, but if we go first, usually we can just sort of manually evolve into some Zoroarks rather than having to use Evo TM and then slow our opponent down with Itchy Pollen. And if we go second, sometimes we're going to miss the Evo and just want to go for Itchy Pollen anyways. Itchy Pollen definitely comes up a lot in this deck. Might even be the deck that I've used, other than Dragapult, that I've used Itchy Pollen the most in. Because you simply, like, any game you go first, you're pretty much always going to be going for Itchy Pollen turn 2, unless you just can't find any Zoroarks. And the deck can be a little bit slow in the early games until you get your Zoroarks out. So typically you are going to want to slow down your opponent a little bit. Next we have Munkidori. So this is key in the Dragapult matchup specifically. Obviously, it can be relevant in some other matchups like Gardevoir. It's really, really strong. But this just makes the Dragapult matchup much, much better. It's a pretty tough matchup without it. I think that the matchup's okay without it, but not nearly as strong. This allows you to sort of just keep your Zoroarks healthy. With this, it honestly synergizes really well with the Reshiram. Your opponent's usually using Phantom Dive to try to take multi-prize turns on multiple Zoroarks at the same time. That way, they don't have to worry about Reshiram's first attack one-hit KOing them. So Munkidori's Adrenabrain here allows us to keep the Zoroarks out of Phantom Dive range, prevent those knockouts, prevent them from setting up those knockouts with things like Phantom Dive on the bench for 60 isn't going to do enough damage to us to allow us to hit for big damage with Reshiram, but it will allow them to set up for a knockout, so then we can heal some of the damage off the Munkidori. And sort of, we're basically trying to force them to say, okay, if you want to knock out these Zoroarks, you're actually going to have to hit into them for some decent damage. You can't just chip away at them to play around Reshiram's first attack. And then one of Fezandipiti EX, of course, pretty staple in this format. Just lets us draw 3 anytime a Pokemon's knocked out. Pretty essential. There's just going to be lots of games where that is going to bail you out. And then we have the one of Pecharunt EX. This is, of course, just good in general with Zoroark. We want to be using the MVP up, which allows us to put energy from discard pile onto the Zoroark, and then bringing the Zoroark from the bench to the active, since that card cannot target Pokemon in the active position. And then, of course, Subjugating Change also allows us to use Binding Mochi, which is pretty key for this deck, both for Darmanitan and for copying Reshiram's second attack. 210 is just a very, very relevant number to be hitting. So getting the Reshiram second attack up to that point is very, very important. But also, there's a lot of things that we can't knock out for 90 damage that we can knock out for 130, right? So, I mean, this also applies with Defiance Band, but boosting those numbers up to hit some more relevant knockouts. Our damage ranges are pretty low, all things considered, so having as many ways to boost that as possible is really nice. And supporters, 4 copies of Arven. So like I said, we are an Evo TM deck, so we are trying to see Evo TM on the first turn as often as possible, Poffin Evo. So 4 copies of Arven is a no-brainer here. 2 copies of Boss's Orders. A lot of time, especially if we are ahead, we are having to sort of chase down those 210 HP Pokemon. Like if we're playing against Raging Bolt, we're trying to chase down things like Teal Mask, we're trying to get rid of things like Fezandipiti. So when our opponent is sort of trying to play patiently and not attack into Reshiram, not allowing us big knockouts, we're often going to need to boss a couple of times to actually take relevant prize cards. 2 copies of Iono. This deck does disrupt a lot, so we are this deck, honestly, think of it in sort of terms of pre-rotation Gardevoir with like Unfair Stamp, where your opponent comes ahead a little bit, and then you in one turn put a bunch of Zoroarks down, use a bunch of trades, use something like Darmanitan to disrupt your opponent's board setup by knocking out some key Pokemon, and using a disruption card like Iono or Unfair Stamp on the same turn to put them down to a low hand size. We're trying to target multiple facets of the opponent's setup and their hand at the same time, and then make a comeback in the late game. This is definitely more of a play from behind deck. Sometimes we can get like an early Darmanitan swing in, which is obviously really nice when it happens, and can get us a few prize cards ahead, but generally speaking, because of our low damage output and our reliance on our opponent hitting into us if we want to actually be taking consistent knockouts, a lot of time we are going to be playing from behind and counting on hand disrupting our opponent over and over again while we just draw as many cards as we want with Zoroarks. Moving on to the item cards, we have 4 copies of Nest Ball. Unfortunately, we can't Buddy-Buddy Poffin for Darumaka, and we do want to try to get it down turn 1 so we can threaten the Darmanitan play. So 4 copies of Nest Ball, 100% necessary to just search out all of our base Pokemon as often as possible, but especially that turn 1 Darumaka. And then 4 Buddy-Buddy Poffin, because we do want to find, ideally 3, sometimes, rarely 4, you kind of want to save some bench space, but usually we want to try to find 3 Zoruas turn 1, so 4 copies of Buddy-Buddy Poffin to help us do that as often as possible. Also, staple in this build. And then 3 copies of Ultra Ball, allows us to search out the Darmanitan when we need it, and the Zoroark when we need it, allows us to get our Dark Energy in the discard pile to be accelerated. We really don't have any. This is the best option to search for our evolution Pokemon. We play a lot of them. We want to search them out a lot. We want to get those Dark Energy in the discard pile, which we can't do unless we find those Zoroarks first. So, Ultra Ball, very, very key to our early game setup in particular. Then 3 ends PP up, so we do need to just have a little bit of extra acceleration. 1 attachment for turn is not going to cut it, especially if our opponent is taking knockouts on us. We don't need the full 4. 3 is definitely enough. But especially if we're doing things like attacking with Darmanitan, we just want to make sure that we get multiple extra attachments over the course of the game. This also helps us get the Munkidori set up, since if we're saving on attachments with the energy acceleration, then we can attach manually for turn to a Munkidori at some point. 2 counter catchers, so like I said, this is something of a comeback deck, especially for setting up plays with Darmanitan. A lot of time we'll like try to counter catcher something up that we can't quite knock out, maybe do like 170 damage to it, and then we can go ahead and finish it off with Darmanitan later, and that way we're playing around things like Fezandipiti, and we are keeping cards like counter catcher and Iono live, still drawing lots of cards off of Ionos ourselves, while our opponent is ideally in the late game drawing pretty small hands off of our disruption cards. So counter catcher, very, very key to the deck, whether for keeping and taking important knockouts on things like Squawkabilly, Mew, 2 prizes that we actually can one-shot, or if we're just trapping stuff in the active while we set up like a multi-prize win turn with our Darmanitan. 1 copy of Earthen Vessel, just so that we have an Arven searchable way to get some dark energies into our hand. 1 copy of Super Rod, if in case our Darmanitan gets targeted, or we have to discard too many Pokemon early on. This is the most flexible recovery card we could play. We do play 1 copy of Night Stretcher still to get, Zoroarks back in a pinch, get things back quickly, but Super Rod, it does synergize pretty well with the deck. We have a lot of search cards that end up being extra in the mid to late game that we are more than happy to use to search out cards that we shuffled back in with Super Rod. And if things like Munkidori or Darmanitan get knocked out, or we just start running out of energy late because of what we've had to discard over the course of the game, then Super Rod is just going to be the more flexible recovery option. And then our ace spec is Unfair Stamp, obviously just a good draw card as well, but very key because we are pretty much always going to be prone to our opponent knocking out key Pokemon. We rely on the Darmanitan, which we only have 1 of on board usually. We only have so many Zoroarks. Our opponent might knock out one of our Zoroarks, and we don't have many other ones left. We really want to have an answer to our opponent's early game aggression. We want to start slowing them down as quickly as possible with an Unfair Stamp. Usually, ideally, you use Itchy Pollen for a little bit. You sort of set up behind the Budew, and then your opponent knocks it out, and you just immediately go Unfair Stamp and then start dismantling their board with Darmanitan, or setting up big plays with just chipping things for 170 and then setting up for a Darmanitan play later. So disrupting our opponent as quickly as possible before they establish a stronger board presence is pretty important. Like the deck, the options that it has are fairly limited, and that's the biggest thing that is holding it back. So we want to really curb how many options our opponent has over the course of the game by applying that immediate disruption to them. Of course, if we prize Unfair Stamp, things are going to get a little bit trickier, but we really do want to be using it early game as often as possible to make this deck, actually viable and have good lines into popular decks. Next, we have Stadiums, Tools, and Energy. We just play 2 copies of End's Castle to give our Ends +1 free retreat. That way, things like Darmanitan and Reshiram don't get stuck there, and we can sort of retreat into our benched End Zoroarks with ease. 2 Tentacle Machine Evolution. We want to use it every game. We're usually just searching it with Arven, but we want to make sure we don't prize it. So just playing 2 copies. I could see going up to a 3rd if you just really want an extra turn 1 Evo consistency, but since we have Budew, we sort of have a plan B if we don't hit the Evo TM. We're making more Evo TMs feel unnecessary. Then the Binding Mochi, we've talked about this quite a bit in the Pecharunt section, so I won't over-explain it, but that 40 damage boost is just really relevant in a lot of situations. And then same with the Defiance Band to a lesser extent. Not as effective, only gets us up to 200, which is not as nice of a number as 210, obviously. There's a lot less things that 200 knocks out than 210. But still really relevant, especially in the early game with the Darmanitan attack in particular, and it can be used with the Darmanitan, right? The only Pokemon that we can boost with Binding Mochi are Dark types, so the End Zoroark's the only thing that's really going to be benefiting from this for the most part. And so we can do a boosted Darmanitan attack with Binding Mochi with Zoroark, but if we actually want to attack with a Darmanitan, which we do sometimes with Reversal Energy, the Defiance Band is really, really key. Especially against decks with Teal Mask, we can go ahead and Defiance Band Reversal Energy our Darmanitan, counter catcher their Teal Mask, Unfair Stamp them, and then we're knocking out their Teal Mask and maybe something like Hoot Hoot, taking a 3-prize turn, or setting up something like a Raging Bolt with enough damage for us to knock it out with Zoroark later. So that being able to actually like attack with Darmanitan is super, super relevant in a lot of matchups, and that Defiance Band, especially against decks with Teal Mask, is going to come in very, very clutch. Then we played 6 copies of Dark Energy. We have the Earthen Vessel searchable with Arven, and we have multiple recovery cards, and our Zoroarks really don't need that many energy to attack. We only need to attack a few times over the course of the game. Plus, we have Night Stretcher and Super Odd if things really get dire on energy attachment, so 6 more than enough. We have lots of ways to find them. And then 2 copies of Reversal Energy, just so that we have options for attacking with Darmanitan. We actually want to attack with Darmanitan most games if we do end up going behind. So having the Reversal Energy to allow that option, very, very important. We don't want to ever prize the Reversal Energy when we need it. And we don't have any way to search for it, so playing 2 copies just to make sure that we can actually draw into it more often, also very important. Moving on to the matchup section, though, we have Charizard, which I do think is one of your better matchups. You can usually Darmanitan them before they can take knockouts. It's also, they are really reliant on Dusknoir to actually one-shot Zoroarks, which means if you can use Darmanitan to pick off their Dusknoir line, then keep your, sort of play around with how you take your other prize cards, that way they aren't one-shotting your Zoroarks, then you can sort of force them in a position where they have to gust around your Zoroarks, or just swing into them and then get one-shotted by Reshiram. So it puts them in just a really, really bad position. They don't really have great ways to play around the combination of Darmanitan's attack picking off their setup Pokemon or their support Pokemon, and then Reshiram being able to punish them for not quite swinging for knockouts into our Zoroark. They do have maximum belt usually, so that can be a bit of a problem. But typically, you can just knock out the Charizard with the maximum belt and then sort of go from there. Also, as a Noctowl deck in general, they are typically typically a lot weaker to things like Unfair Stamp and Iono. In this matchup, we really want to try to use Darmanitan to pick off Pidgey and Duskull early game. That way, because the Pidgeot is really what's going to keep them alive under our Stamp and constant Ionos. Next, we have Raging Bolt, another deck that, is typically playing the Noctowl engine right now and does get punished really hard by Unfair Stamp and Ionos in combination with things like Darmanitan knocking out Teal Mask and Hoot Hoot on the same turn. That is going to be probably the matchup where that is most relevant. Terrabox, of course, that is also really strong. But the Raging Bolt matchup is really where that comes up the most, where we're trying to go for those Darmanitan plays to set up the Raging Bolts with enough damage for Zoroark to knock out using Reshiram's attack, and we're trying to pick off Teal Mask or Hoot Hoot in combination with Disruption as well. So Raging Bolt, another very good matchup, just as they have a lot of Pokemon that can actually be knocked out by Reshiram's second attack, at least boosted by Binding Mochi. Whereas some decks that we're going to talk about we have tougher matchups into just don't have a lot of good targets for us to even knock out in general, just because of our damage ranges are so limited. Even matchups, we have our Chaladon. So our Chaladon can be pretty prone to disruption throughout the game. They don't typically have a lot of good onboard draw. And they can't one-shot our Zoroark, which means that if they swing into our Zoroark, we will be one-shotting them back with the Reshiram. However, the problem is that we can't one-shot them either, which means they can just sort of Turo out of it. If we have to use Pecharunt or Fezandipiti at any point, they can sort of bring those up for easy prize cards. So we sort of playing this game where, we can't really one-shot them, and then they just Turo, but they can't really one-shot us either. However, they're also usually going to take the first few prize cards, and obviously Darmanitan's not hitting the Chaladon for weakness after attacks, so Darmanitan doesn't become a very good attacker in that matchup either. They don't play Pokemon that we can really easily target down with Darmanitan. If we want to attack with Darmanitan itself, we can at least pick off our Chaladon, and then a Duraludon. And then, depending on the build, we might be able to knock out something like a Dunsparce or a Baby Pecharunt, depending on the variant they're playing, a Scyther. They might have some extra Pokemon around in their deck that we actually can pick on with Darmanitan, but generally speaking, there aren't a lot of attacking targets for us. If they have to use Fezandipiti at any point, we can go ahead and pick that off with a Reshiram attack. But generally speaking, it really just depends on how well they set up. This is a matchup where Budew is going to be really important to slow them down early, because if we can initiate the prize trade, then we can be in a much better position. Like I said, like it is definitely like pretty well positioned for you, the fact that they can't one-shot you. That is like your biggest plus in this matchup. However, if they're playing something like the poison build, then they actually, with Binding Mochi and Black Belt or Kirin, can go for that one-hit knockout, or then they can even potentially donk you with poison shenanigans. So I've sort of talked about this in my other deck profiles, but Archaladon's sort of a weird deck to talk about its matchup spread with right now, because there are so many different variants of the deck, and honestly, they all have such different options. I don't think their matchup spreads are that different, but their options certainly are. Like, it's very different playing against a poison Archaladon versus a scissor Archaladon, or just a pure Archaladon. You're targeting down different Pokemon in each scenario, but generally, I think this matchup is fairly even, because both of you are sort of, honestly, Archaladon isn't really well equipped to deal with your deck, and you aren't really well equipped to deal with their deck. So you're both just sort of trying to figure out how to piece together 6 prize cards in a pretty long game. Next, we have Terrorbox. So Terrorbox is a deck that can definitely overwhelm us very quickly with Torrential Pump. If they go first, we can of course overwhelm them quickly with Darmanitan. If we go first, we can also try to stop them from using Torrential Pump by slowing down with Budew, but a lot of time that isn't going to be enough if they just have like Noctowl for Crispin and Sparkling Crystal. So, and we can't one-shot the Pikachu EX, which is of course a problem as well, since the Pikachu EX can take the one-shot on us. Our saving grace in this matchup is that they aren't super well equipped to deal with Unfair Stamp and multiple Iono. These Noctowl engine decks do sort of struggle against hand disruption a little bit more than others. We can sort of just knock out their Mew with Darmanitan attack copied with Zoroark, since we hit for weakness on the Mew. So a common play in this matchup was going to be to hand disrupt them and then copy Darmanitan with Zoroark to knock out Mew and a Hoot, and that sort of limits like their draw options by a substantial margin. The reason that I'd say that, like, generally, if you actually get to play the game, you're in a pretty good spot. They have a lot of 210 HP Pokemon that you can knock out with Reshiram's second attack, so there's no shortage of Pokemon that you can target down to take 2 prize knockouts on. However, sometimes they just go first and they get like a turn 2 Torrential Pump, and you just don't really have a great response to it. You can't draw out of it every game, and sometimes you are going to hand disrupt them as much as you want, but they're just going to like find the Noctowl and be able to keep attacking, set up the Pikachu EX, which you have trouble dealing with. Now, one nice thing is that if they do chip damage anything at some point, you can like Adrenabrain to break a Pikachu EX, but honestly, there aren't that many situations where they actually are going to leave chip damage on something, so that obviously makes it less relevant. Teal Mask also, both for Bolt and Terrorbox, can be a bit annoying as a 3 energy attacker that can one-shot your Zoroark, but it also gets one-shotted back very easily and can be one-shotted by the Darmanitan play. So Darmanitan with Reversal Energy Defiance Band sort of naturally gives you a built-in response to a aggressive Teal Mask play. So there's a lot going on in this matchup, but I think generally, I mean, of course, if you go first, you're trying to go for the Darmanitan play, and then you're just trying to look for whatever the easiest prizes you can get each turn are, without disrupting your opponent as much as possible, so that it's more difficult for them to chain together big plays. Dragapult Dusknoir. So this is another relatively even matchup. I think that might even lean slightly in our favor, but I'm sort of hesitant to go that far with Zoroark. Definitely is a deck with more limited options and damage ranges as opposed to Dragapult Dusknoir, which is a deck with a lot of options in how it spreads its damage around. And generally just in a vacuum more powerful deck. So I think that especially a very good Dragapult player is going to have more often get the best of you with like careful use of their Dusknoir and hand disruptions. However, generally speaking, we are fairly equipped to deal with this matchup. The Adrenabrain helps you a ton. Like I said, just healing your Zoroarks out of range to sort of force your opponent to actually hit into the Zoroark's relevant damage to trigger Reshiram if they actually want to deal with your Zoroarks, or use Dusknoirs to set up that damage, which is honestly equally bad for them, especially because we're usually going to take the prize lead here. We're going to go for Darmanitan early, take 2 prize cards. A lot of time we can even just like Darmanitan back to back, and take a big lead. This is one of the few matchups where we are definitely the aggressor. And then from that point, if they try to you know, once they're trying to actually do stuff with Phantom Dives, you can just sort of Adrenabrain to keep your Zoroarks healthy, and then two-shot their Dragapult with Reshiram. And it's very difficult for them to use Dusknoir in these situations because of how many prize cards you take with Darmanitan in the early game. So, honestly, it really depends on how well they draw, how well you draw. Both players are going to be disrupting each other a lot throughout the game. I think that that you're maybe a little bit more likely, you need a little bit more to sustain your board. You know, if they really just need Dragapults, maybe a counter catcher and Iono every turn to keep doing what they want to do. Whereas you need realistically to like have multiple Zoroarks in play to keep drawing out of Ionos. You need a bit of a stronger setup. They can sort of counter catcher and target down your Darmanitan, take away that option. They can target down the Reshiram on a key turn and take away that option while Ionoing you. And you need to keep, if you're using Darmanitan multiple times, you need to keep finding more energy acceleration because you keep discarding the energy off your Zoroark. So you just need to keep finding a lot more pieces than they do. And you find like End's Castle to actually get your Pokemon out of the active if they counter catcher something with that energy on it. Like a Zoroark with that energy on it. So there is just, and then you can bench your Pecharunt EX to get out of that. However, then that gives them an easy 2 prize cards without having to swing into your end Zoroark. So it's a very careful balancing act of a matchup. I do think it probably leans slightly in our favor, honestly, but it's relatively close. And then unfavorable matchups, we have Gardevoir. Certainly a very winnable matchup. Gardevoir is kind of a pile right now, so I'm tempted to even put it into even just because of how often Guardy just sort of bricks in the current format. You know, you might be able to just like Darmanitan a couple times and just win the game. They just never get set up. And of course, you do hit for weakness on the Gardevoir. I mean, you can take pretty easy one-shots on it. However, if they do get set up and just start, you know, swing, you don't really have a good answer to Drifloon and Screamtails being able to just so easily take 2 prize cards every turn, especially in combination with the Adrenabrains. So even though you do have the pieces to win this matchup, I think that, especially if they go for something like Budew or Budew to slow you down early on, that item lock can actually be pretty detrimental to you. And I think that generally speaking, it's just very difficult for you to deal with a deck that like can swing for knockouts against you with 1 prizers really easily. They have a lot of comeback potential against you, even if you take like sort of a lead with Darmanitan. And of course, if you have Darmanitan or Reshiram on in play, that does open you up to a lot of lines where they just sort of bump your stadium. I know you do a low hand size, and then just Screamtail around your Darmanitan, right? Because you have to find one of your 2 Ends Castle to actually get that Darmanitan out of the active. Which, if they're targeting down your support Pokemon with Screamtail, it can be very hard to hit. Alright, a bit of an abrupt cut here because I had to re-record this part. Goldengo should definitely be more in the even spot, potentially even favorable. Typically, you can Darmanitan early game to take a couple of prize cards, so you're usually going to start the game with a lead. Even if they get an attack off before you start swinging with Darmanitan, that you should still, when you do swing at Darmanitan, retake the prize lead. They're also pretty weak to Unfair Stamp and Iono throughout the game, and they are weak to Budew early on, which is an option that we have available to us as well. Once they do get set up, they can trade pretty efficiently with us by counter-catching or bossing our Zoroarks, but we can go ahead and anytime that they take a knockout with Goldengo on something, we can actually bring up the Darmanitan and use its first attack. We can set up with End's PP up and go ahead and just put 2 energy on the Darmanitan and swing for knockouts in return with Darmanitan's first attack thanks to the fire weakness. They have to put enough energy into their discard pile if they want to knock out something like a Zoroark in order to actually take the 2 prize cards. So that enables us to go ahead and knock them out with Darmanitan, which is a single prizer that we can combine with hand disruption. So being able to swing in like that into their Goldengos in the mid to late game, typically I think should swing the matchup into our favor. However, they can still go ahead and set up their Dragapult in the mid to late game to sort of play around that. They can take, you take a bit of a prize lead with their Darmanitan, but maybe they go, they take the first prize with Goldengo, you swing with their Darmanitan, take 2 prize cards, and then you return knockout the Goldengo with your Darmanitan. So you're going down to about 3 prize cards there, but then if they set up the Dragapult at that point and start hand disrupting you, they can sort of just set up 2 Dragapults and try to win that way. Or they can set up like maybe get 2 Phantom Dives off, then convert back into a Goldengo to one-shot something for their last couple of prize cards. So they do have some counterplay to what you have going on, but I think that generally speaking, using Darmanitan's second attack with Zoroark early and then transitioning into using Darmanitan's first attack in the mid to late game is usually going to be enough to swing through the Goldengos. If they're not playing the Dragon Bolt build, even easier. I think that Darmanitan should typically be able to sweep them pretty well. So yeah, probably more of closer to a favorable matchup with the help of that Darmanitan's first attack. And you should definitely be trying to set up both of your Darmanitans in the matchup. I don't think there's a lot of matchups where you want or need to bench both of your Darumakas, but this is probably going to be the exception. Next we have Walls. So we just lose to Cornerstone, unfortunately. The only thing that can attack Cornerstone in the deck, other than Zorua for like a little bit of damage, which is obviously not going to do much of anything, is Darmanitan, and only if we are behind. So eventually, and we only play 2 Reversal Energy, so eventually we will just run out of Reversal Energy, even attacking with Darmanitan, even if our opponent takes a lead. There's just really nothing we can do about Cornerstone, let alone 2 Cornerstone, which is what most Walls lists are running. And then we have Feraligatr. Now, we don't play many ways to deal with things like Mimikyu. Again, Darmanitan is our only way to deal with... Darmanitan and Zorua are our only ways to deal with Mimikyu, and that's just not going to be enough, especially when our opponent can just not take prize cards until, Feraligatr is a deck that's really good at trying to set up like a 6 prize turn at the end of the game. Of course, we have Munkidori to try to counter that a little bit, but our one Munkidori is not going to be enough to counter their multiple Munkidoris, especially when they're just using Ghost Eye with an active Mimikyu, or, maybe reverse thrusting with Croconaw back into Mimikyu for like 150 damage a turn. We just don't have good options to deal with Mimikyu in general, honestly. They could probably just sit 2 Mimikyu on the board, and not do anything except maybe Adrenabrain some Zorua damage off of them, and probably still win. We just would deck out eventually. We don't have enough Boss Orders to pick off all their Munkidoris, or take 6 prize cards around Mimikyu either, so that's not really an option. The best thing that we can do is try to pick off their setup Pokemon early with the Darmanitan attack copied with Zoroark, but we're still just going to fold to the Mimikyu eventually, most likely. That is all of the matchups that I have to cover, though. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this and want to check out any of my other content or my socials, all of that will be in the link tree below. Have a great day.